July speaker, and those of you that are end abuse members, you certainly know Stephanie Dowds. She has served in Long Beach since 2008. She's the Deputy City Prosecutor for the City of Long Beach. She's also one of our recent awardees for End Abuse Long Beach from December of 2015. And during that presentation, you heard such great work that she did here. But Stephanie is a great advocate for domestic violence victims in this city. She works very tirelessly in all aspects of our community, including being a board member at the Women's Shelter of Long Beach. And again, she is truly an advocate for DV victims here in Long Beach. And today she's going to talk to us about prosecuting those domestic violence cases that we know her so well for. Welcome, Stephanie.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me better with the microphone or without the microphone? With it? Okay. I'm not used to using one, so I have a whole PowerPoint set up for you guys, but we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, so hopefully I'll be able to get it going once I start getting into my lecture. But right now, if I could just direct your attention to the handout, it follows along with some of my slides, and I can start talking to you about domestic violence. So basically, what I aim to talk to you guys about today is domestic violence prosecution, more specifically in the City of Long Beach and also more at the misdemeanor level, because that's what we do in the Long Beach City Prosecutor's Office, but this will also be a good overview for domestic violence prosecution in general. So the main goals of my lecture are to kind of discuss what we do and a lot of the obstacles that we face in prosecuting domestic violence cases. Some of the agency crossover that we have, because I know here everybody is kind of in the domestic violence world, but maybe in a different kind of facets, counseling and whatnot. And through prosecution, what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? Because everybody plays such an important part. Everyone in this room plays such an important part in what we do with helping victims of abuse. And I know our process of being prosecutors is just one end of it, and it can get a little bit of tunnel vision. And you'll see in my presentation kind of why that can happen. So we're just so grateful for all the work that everybody in this room does, because every facet of it is so important. And thank you so much for that. So first I just want to talk about what I mean as a prosecutor by saying domestic violence, the term. It's defined for us by the Family Code section 6211. And I think when a lot of people hear the word DV or domestic violence or domestic abuse, they think of like just the general relationship between a boyfriend and a girlfriend or a husband and wife, and it's much more broad than that. It's technically spouse or former spouse, cohabitant or former cohabitant, current or former dating or engagement relationship, a fellow parent, so if you have a child in common, or any person that's related by 2 degrees of consanguinity. And hopefully I'll get the PowerPoint going here soon so I can show you my chart on that, because I think visuals are really helpful. But basically, a good way to think about it is that domestic abuse really talks about like the relationship. That's what the law is looking to protect, is people that are in those vulnerable relationships where there's trust, and because of that trust, people get hurt. And so under the law, anyone that's like traditional dating relationship, married, shares a child, that falls under domestic violence. But also child abuse falls under that, and elderly abuse. So really anything that's like a family kind of relationship within 2 degrees. So good examples that we maybe don't usually think about when we think about DV would be like a brother and sister, a child and grandparent, but not like a cousin or an aunt or uncle. So once the relationship, they could still be related, but once it starts to get too far removed, then we're not as worried about that special relationship being abused. So does that kind of make sense when I use the term DV? I'm actually talking about child abuse and elderly abuse as well. Yes?
So I see how you're going for child abuse. Now, when it says fellow parent, does it mean the opposite if the kid does something to the parent?
It does, yeah, and we do see those. Our office doesn't handle juvenile cases, but we definitely see cases where there's children that are adults and they're taking advantage of their parent. You know, the parent has sought a restraining order. I'm sure Paul has dealt with this before. And because the child, maybe it's because of mental illness, there's a lot of different factors that can come into play, but is abusive towards the parent, and that's considered domestic violence in terms of prosecution. No problem. Any questions? Yeah, just let me know. Also, yeah, so child abuse is encompassed in this, and you know, that's typically we think of like, you know, children that are minors that are being abused by a parent, but yeah, it can go the other direction as well. Like, and it doesn't necessarily need to be an elder for it to be domestic violence. Usually elder abuse is over like a certain age, but also like you asked, a child with a parent. And I actually have a specific case that I'm thinking of right now that you mentioned of that's very, very thick repeat offender, and it's, you know, just constantly coming back and violating the restraining order, and the parent doesn't know what else to do. And really, like, unless they get, you know, some mental resources help or something like that, our end of it, all we have left is the jail time to try and keep that person, you know, safe. So that's kind of where we're coming from, and that's why I say thank you so much to all the people in this room, because all the other options are so helpful in getting people on the right track and rehabilitated. And just on a side note, the misdemeanor level, which is what we do, I really think it's the gateway to more serious abuse. Once you get to the felony level, it's much more difficult to rehabilitate people, and that's a lot of reasons why I think those sentences are much more harsh. They're in years, and ours are typically in days, you know, somewhere like anywhere from a couple of days in jail, they're on probation, to 180 days or a year. And this is, you know, the time where things are happening that are much more minor in terms of like the severity of the injuries, and I'm going to get into that too. Things are happening around small children that are, you know, learning these behaviors early on in their lives, and if we can stop that early on, especially in the child abuse misdemeanor level, because sometimes part of that is just a difference of opinion or cultural or so many different factors that can come into play, where I've seen cases where parents are like, I didn't know that this was a wrong behavior to hit my kid with a belt. And that can kind of fall, you know, on both sides of the fence, depending on like what generation you're from, what mentality, you know, you grew up with, and how you were raised. And just getting somebody into parenting classes, you know, can really change that behavior and make a huge difference in their child's life in the future and prevent future abuse, which is really one of the big end goals of what we're trying to accomplish, stopping the cycle of violence. So, sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. So that's basically what DV is defined as for criminal prosecution purposes. And if you want to look more into detail about it in writing, you can look in the Family Code section 6211. So the next thing I want to go over with you guys is basically kind of some of the common charges that we're dealing with for domestic violence prosecution. There's battery, DV specific, simple battery. So you can see how I wrote down 242, simple battery. So that's kind of like what we would charge if it was like a brother-sister relationship, versus like the 273.5 or 243E, and I don't want to get too legalese numbers on you because I know that probably doesn't translate, but those have like a specific element to them of for the domestic violence relationship that we have to prove. But the thing about these charges in domestic violence for misdemeanors is that they tend to have a larger exposure. They're usually almost always a year maximum sentence, where most misdemeanors are normally 180 days. So definitely under the law, they're taken more seriously. And I'm going to get into that later about some of the sentencing mandatory requirements for domestic violence charges as well. But there's more potential for longer jail time and harsher sentences because of that confidential, trusting relationship that's involved. But on our end, we also have to prove that. All right, so another thing that I want to point out to you is the restraining orders versus a protective order, and I have an example of it later in my presentation. But they're actually two different things, but they are charges that we prosecute, and they're sort of similar in the way that we prosecute them. But if somebody gets a civil restraining order, that doesn't come through our office. I think Paul does those. And if that's violated, then we would prosecute it as a criminal charge. Once a criminal case has been filed, when it's a domestic violence case, we always issue a protective order for criminal cases. And if that's violated, then that's a charge. So for instance, I was just reviewing a case the other day where there was a woman who really scratched up the back of her, at the time, boyfriend. I think they were breaking up, and they had a child in common. They were still living together but trying to separate. And the ones with the female defendants, male victims, they're hard cases to prove because you go into it with the jurors not really wanting to be as tough, I think, on it, because they think, just generally that women tend more often to be the victims. But in this case, so she and him were fighting, and she scratched his back and ripped his shirt, and it could have been, she could have said, oh, well, it's mutual combat, or, he hit me first, because the problem with a lot of these cases is that they're one-on-one. It's he said, she said. So if both people have injuries, it gets difficult to prove. So she was not in custody while the case is pending. She's out of custody, which is not something that we like, because we prefer people to, especially on these cases, to be in custody while the case is pending so that there's a cooling off period and the victim is safer. And so while this case was pending, so you would think people would be on their best behavior while they have a criminal case pending against them. But she wasn't, and she started texting him multiple times, and that's a violation of the protective order that we had issued at the beginning of this other case. And then she went over to his house to get some items, and they got into a verbal dispute, and it turned physical. And so we ended up adding new charges to that case, and hopefully, based on that, we'll be able to get her remanded. It hasn't come back to court yet, into custody to protect the victim. But this is something that we see, sadly, kind of a lot. Just the thing about violence, as you probably all know, is that it comes back. It's very typical. So the more we can do to rehabilitate in the end, but also keep people away from each other, have that cooling off period, and then also protect them from each other and from themselves, because people make bad decisions about it when you're emotionally invested. Yeah?
Stephanie, do you have any guidelines about restraining order violations? We have a lot of clients who get very frustrated because the opposing party will repeatedly violate the restraining order, and the police often just about take a report only if they insist, but then nothing really happens. So what does it take to get something to restraining order violation prosecution?
That's a good question. I can't really say exactly what it takes, like a black and white line. I guess my last example where I was trying to sort of go with that as well is that it's the whole picture that helps in terms of being able to successfully prosecute a case. Yeah.
So I can add a little. I'm a probation officer for LA County. I did adult DV and I did juvenile. When I did my adult, once it was reported to me, I would write a violation report right to the court, and it would bring it into court very quickly. So I had one where the other parent was really slick at what he was doing, and he would kind of stop the lady and he would park away, and she had all these pictures. So everything that she brought me back in, I completed the report right away, took it in, and it got him, because they were trying to take the kid through the grandfather. It was crazy. But what I told her to do, I said, I can't do anything without you coming to testify. She didn't really want to do it, but she said, okay, I'm going to do it. So I said, you have to gather your information. She gathered everything that she needed, and we basically got him. He went to jail to complete his time. Because
I
he was
think the
bad.
difference with that is that the guy was already on probation.
He was on,
In
yes.
our case, we're usually doing the civil restraining orders, so we don't have an awesome probation officer like you.
I would say definitely one of the most important things, as it sounds like you're already doing, is
We get on probation.
Yeah.
advise them to call the police every time there's an incident, because a victim might say, well, I know he drove by my house, and from the police perspective and from the prosecutor perspective, it might be like, okay, is that a violation? Is it not a violation? Were they within the 100 yards? Was it knowingly? There's a lot of factors that we have to take into consideration. Yeah.
Something that I also suggest to those victims in that situation is if you have a neighbor who saw what happened, have them stick around to give a statement to the police officer when you're coming out. Take screenshots of anything on their phone. If they're sending text messages, save voicemails, if they're through that kind of information.
Yes, that is all really good information. That's my coworker, Alicia Rodriguez, and also my right-hand woman in domestic violence prosecution. She's our victim advocate. All that, and then continue. I know victims tend to get frustrated, like you're talking about in that situation where they're like, what's the point of making a report? But if they do make reports about each little instance that happens, it's much easier for us to see kind of the global picture of what's going on and when people are being manipulative and trying to purposely just circumvent, the system and not get caught. Because there's really dumb criminals and there's really smart ones. So, gotta kind of be on the outlook for all of it, but evidence-wise, in terms of being able to go forward and prosecute those cases, the more evidence we have, whether it's multiple police reports, like Alicia mentioned, witnesses, screenshots, all of those things, of text messages, those are so helpful. Because when there's like maybe not, the conduct's not so severe, like I mentioned, like somebody driving past, versus like a text message, which is also maybe not such a severe instance, but it's such a technical violation, and it's much easier to prove because jurors are gonna be like, well, it's right here, on the paper. Yeah.
I was gonna add one other thing too, for the victim themselves. Sometimes they'll do the protective order and then they're feeling sorry, and then they wanna think that they can circumvent and go back, because even though the order's in place, then they'll become friends and then they'll go, but they're in violation once they go, and it's sometimes a setup. So I suggest that even, they need to know that don't try to take matters in your own hands. Once you get the order, you gotta abide by it and not let the other person say, oh, we'll get along, let's just come back, because they're really setting up the field.
Yeah, and that's something that we do deal with a lot too, is where, especially in the criminal cases, because whether they want a protective order or they don't want a protective order, we're issuing them. And as opposed to the civil restraining order where they've got to go seek it out. And so, especially at the misdemeanor stage where things maybe this is the first time it's happened, or it's a newer kind of instance, they don't want the protective order, or they want it removed, or they want it and then later things are better and the people have gone to their classes and they want it removed or modified. And that's why there are requirements under the law when a case is filed as a domestic violence case that require that protective order to be in place, which is so important because it kind of just takes it out of the victim's hand. And it helps us too as prosecutors, because a lot of times they see us as the bad guy that's breaking up their relationship. And, you know, we're trying to do what's best for everybody, but it's not always easy. And there's a lot of conflict involved on all ends, because you've got the defense attorney and the defendant, which are typically, you know, against you, but then a lot of times the victim as well. So, all right, so going back to some of the frequently charged charges, a couple other ones that I wanted to point out that I have listed is intimidating a witness and battery on a police officer and resisting arrest. So intimidating a witness, you can imagine what that is, you know, where it could be something as minor actually as the person who's been charged saying to the victim, don't testify, you know, I love you and we're gonna work it out and don't go to court. That's still influencing, you know, somebody who's a victim or a witness on a case not to go forward with a lawful order for them to come to court and testify. So that's actually a charge that can come up a lot of times after we've filed a case. And then there's a lot of charges that you wouldn't think necessarily are domestic violence charges, but they kind of end up going hand in hand with domestic violence, like resisting arrest or battery on a peace officer. So say something happens right in the home and the police get called out and then they go to investigate it, and you know, a lot of times these instances involve alcohol or drugs, and so people are very aggressive towards everybody involved, and the police officers, you know, they're trying to defuse the situation, but they end up getting kicked or punched, or you know, no, they're not being listened to and put in danger as well. So that's very, very common for that to happen. And so anything that really also another one I want to point out to you is vandalism. So this is domestic violence too. So if somebody, you know, a couple gets into a fight, right, and then somebody stabs their tires or, you know, scratches their car or whatever, it's not necessarily like violence one-on-one, but yeah, it's still DV. Yeah.
Is it violence if someone goes up to your house and like vandalizes it with spray paint?
If they have a relationship, yes.
Yeah, like if it's like an ex-boyfriend writing like rude things in your house.
Yes, that's domestic violence. That's considered domestic violence under the law. And so that's like actually a perfect example because people don't think about that, and it is. Yes?
So I have a question. Now, I know you said you're with adults. Now, with this 148, the 148 and the assault on the police officer, if it's DV involved, you would suggest that would be DV under a juvenile as well, if a juvenile did it to those officers?
Well, the law would apply the same, but then the court system is different. So I can't really tell you what would happen like to a juvenile.
I mean, the law is the same.
Same charges.
Yeah, because we're doing something new, vamping with our juveniles and DV. Now I'm an intake juvenile officer, so that would be something we didn't actually know. I'll take it back. Because we do some special stuff in our division now. But those two charges, I wasn't aware that could be possible DVs.
Yeah, it just depends on how things go down.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean, it's really the kind of easy way to explain it is, did this incident begin because of a special relationship? That makes, it sort of becomes an umbrella, everything that happened after, within a degree, you know, obviously not something that's like super remote, domestic violence. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I think I have my PowerPoint now. Hey, almost. It's not clicking. catch up to where we're at. So this is what I was talking about before in terms of defining domestic violence. And this is more of the general terms that you can think of it as an umbrella. Okay, this is an example of the consanguinity aspect. People here know about this, or is this not something that you're, okay. So this just kind of explains what the law sees as a special relationship. So you can see the numbers on there. So if it's within 2 degrees, so you have the person or the victim, right? And then within 2 degrees, so children, grandchildren, parents, grandparents, if the relationship is there. So there's the examples that we were just talking about, vandalism and 148. If the relationship is there and the incident arises out of that, it's considered domestic violence. And then it's filed in court that way, and that means that this code section, Penal Code 1203.097, kind of a mouthful, but when you're in our business, you say it a lot because it's super important. It basically says, this is what you are required to do because your case was filed as a domestic violence case, as opposed to just a regular battery, like person A walking down the street punches person B, or person A is walking down the street, cops tell them to stop and they run. That would be like a resisting arrest, not related to domestic violence. Okay. These are the common charges. All right, so how does this go down? How does the process of prosecution take place from kind of start to finish? So that's sort of what I'm going to go over with you right now, and the result of that. And then if you have questions, in between, please feel free to ask. Okay, so an incident occurs. So basically, like the most typical we would see is something happens in the home. So you have this private relationship in the home, and somebody calls 911. The victim, a child, a neighbor, maybe a friend that's over, maybe a relative that lives with them. That's the kind of situations that typically come up. And you can kind of see from that list that almost none of those people are going to be objective, except for maybe like a neighbor who doesn't really know them and is not really involved. And then at that time, they're also not really witnessing it visually. They might hear things, which can be helpful in terms of prosecution, but they're not independent percipient witnesses, meaning they witnessed what went down. Okay. All right, and then after the 911 call is generated, so police come out, and if children are present, then that's usually when DCFS gets contacted as well, and reports start getting generated and they start getting involved in the instances. So if they're present or if they're the victims of the abuse, like if it's a child abuse or child neglect case. Then they start doing an investigation. So that means the police will take all the parties involved and separate them and get their statements, because this is really important to us, because when everyone's really upset at the time of the incident, that's when they're the most truthful. And that's also the way that the law sees it too. So we always end up coming back to that later on in terms of proving our cases. What did they say at the scene? What did they say in the 911 call? Because that's when people are upset. That's when they're going to tell you what really happened, as opposed to later on, which I'll get later into my discussion. When they've made up and when they don't want to prosecute and they don't want the protective order or the restraining order or all those things. So that's, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you know what the status is in Long Beach of the body cams for the officers? I know, a long time ago, 15 years ago, we tried to institute giving the sergeants cameras to record the victims, because what you're saying is so important, because they always change their story in between the time that the officer is taking the report and they get to court. And we wanted to get their statements recorded right after the incident, because then, people see how upset they are. was just too much hassle. The cops just couldn't manage taking a camera out there. So I'm wondering, with these body cams coming online, will that become a tool for prosecutors, do you think? And does Long Beach have that instituted yet?
It's definitely going to become a tool. It's definitely being instigated and going to be taken into effect. I don't think it's in full effect yet. I think LA has been kind of one of the first agencies to really get into using that and making that part of their system. I think we're starting to see some, but at some point it is supposed to be for all police officers.
But you haven't had an opportunity to try that yet?
I haven't seen one yet. But I know that it's in the works. So they are working on getting that done and having that basically for every officer is the end goal. And then once they do their investigation, so basically interview all the witnesses involved, take pictures of the injuries, recordings of, sometimes like they'll go and interview the defendant and record their statements, which is really helpful. Then the detectives will bring the case to us and present it to the prosecutor's office as a domestic violence filing. So at the investigation stage, the things that we're usually evaluating is, first off, the relationship, because if we're going to file it as domestic violence, that has to be there. The extent of the injuries, whether there is an injury, there isn't an injury, to what degree, so that kind of makes a determination in terms of like whether this would be the misdemeanor or the felony level. We want to know any possible witnesses, because we're always expecting the victim to change their story. And was there any kind of weapon involved? Is there a history of violence between the couples? And, excuse me, Long Beach is really great about, their officers are really great about asking that at the scene, because a lot of times that won't be reflected in the rap sheets, and that's something that, as I'll mention later on, that we can use in a case for domestic violence that you can't typically do in a normal prosecution. So it's really important, because you'll hear a lot of victims say, yeah, there's been past instances of violence, but I've never reported it. So we want to be aware of that. And if the children were present, because like I said before, if children are present during an instance between a couple, then DCFS is contacted. If they're victims, DCFS is contacted. And we consider them to be more of the experts on what's going on in the home than we are. So we like to know what they think.
Yeah, I work with law in the clinic, and a question that I think really comes up is like, what advice would you give to moms? It seems like there's oftentimes there's a kid there, they want to do everything to protect them, but then dad is hurting them, dad is hurting the kid, and they're terrified of calling the cops or getting the cops involved because they don't want their kids taken away from them. And they love them, they're trained to, they just can't protect them.
It's a couple that doesn't live together, or people that do live together?
But more often, like people who live together and have a child, maybe they're dating, maybe they're married or something, but I feel like this has happened quite a few times where the mom is like, I can't call the cops, they're gonna take my kid away. Like,
I'd say document as much as you can. Try to get a restraining order as soon as you can, because that's the first step before things kind of usually go criminal. And to still call the police, because the more reports that are generated, like I said, and the more documentation, the easier it is to substantiate what's going on. In terms of their fear of the children being taken away, I don't really know that much about family court, so I can't really say. I don't want to give wrong advice, but documentation is really helpful.
We would say make the call, because otherwise you're at risk of being charged with failing to protect the children. So.
Yeah. Always, our answer is always call the police as well. Okay, so those are the things that we're looking at. So once the case is packaged by detectives, it's brought to our office or the prosecutor's office. We have a really great staff that is just specific to domestic violence, and they will do research in the system to see, if there's a history in terms of cases, past cases, things like that, so that by the time it gets to me, a prosecutor, to review it for filing. And what I mean by filing is, are we going to go forward and prosecute this case? Do we not think there's enough evidence to go forward and we're not going to prosecute the case? Are we going to maybe refer it to a probation violation or a felony probation violation instead of a new filing? Are we going to recommend that at this point we think that they should maybe go get a civil restraining order and not file a case? There's different options more than just prosecute or not prosecute that we try to use as avenues, but we are kind of limited in some sense. So we like to have the whole picture of everything. And then once it's presented and we have the evidence that we need, then we file it as DV. And section 1109 is the really important evidence code section when I keep saying file as DV, because it allows for the prior instances of domestic violence filed with the police or not filed to come in a trial, depending on the judge, but it should come in a lot of circumstances. We also put notices in the complaint that we intend to bring this forward in the trial, which you wouldn't have in a normal complaint. So it's also important that you have those notices in there and it's filed correctly, because I've seen cases come through where people don't know, like say a brother-sister case is DV, right? And so they file it as a normal case and not as a domestic violence case, and then we haven't put the defense on notice, and we have an uphill battle of changing the complaint and getting this, additional evidence in if there's like a history of abuse or things like that. Also something that we check too is we look at the rap sheets for both the victims and the defendants at the time of filing, because a lot of domestic violence is, as you all know here, can be back and forth between both parties, and doesn't mean that it didn't happen or the incident isn't valid, but it is something that we need to know about what's going on. So we check to see the history between them, and we want to have the full picture with all the past reports and the current incident. Yeah?
When we say history, as we are hearing right now, call the police, does that populate? How many times has the police been called to that home, even if nothing else has been filed? Because that's one of the uphill battles for us, like for a first offender. Mm-hmm. They finally disclose, they're finally saying, I want the police, I'm gonna tell them the truth, he choked me, I passed out, but there's nothing else but that particular incident. So does the history also, do they collect all the phone calls made to the police?
They do. Well, I see them if there's a police report. Does that make sense? Like if they've been called out and they've made a report, then there's usually what's called a call history that goes with it, and a call number. But if there's no report, then probably not. Although at this stage, I don't think that there's many calls for domestic violence that do not generate a report, because I think the police are pretty well trained that if it is considered domestic violence, there's some kind of report generated. That, as opposed to maybe something else where, the situation gets diffused or they don't, think that there's enough to arrest or whatever. Usually in domestic violence, there is some sort of report documentation generated, in my experience. That could also be like an agency thing too, depending on like what their policies are, police department wise. So I know you guys probably deal with all different agencies. We're mostly dealing with Long Beach, but sometimes I've seen a CHP DV case where a CHP officer was driving down the street, stopped at a stoplight, looks over, and this guy is beating his girlfriend in the car. And so there's no call, he stops them, he does his own investigation, and we proceed forward. She's not cooperative at all, hasn't been cooperative from the beginning, so we have no statement from her, no 911 call. All we have is a witness in the car next to that person. So there wouldn't be, anything generated from that. but that could be a prior instance unless it was, filed or that officer took that initiative and, stopped the crime, even though they're more of a traffic officer. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so once somebody either pleads or gets sentenced, actually even when it's filed, the section governs domestic violence filings, and it gives us the ability to get a protective order issued at arraignment, which is not typical in a criminal case. There's certain exceptions for that. Usually, if you're going to have a protective order because there's a case involving violence and it's not domestic violence, you wouldn't be able to get it until the plea or the conviction. So if someone says guilty or the jury says guilty, that's what I mean by plea versus conviction. But in DV, right off the bat, that's like the first thing that we try to do, because that heat, that argument, that intensity, that fight needs to be, let's keep them separated as soon as possible and for everybody's protection. So that's a really, really important thing, a tool that we try to use to prevent, even if people are in custody, they end up sometimes, bailing out, or they'll call. I had a DV case once where the guy called her to come pick him up from jail after the order was issued, and then she didn't, and then he went to her house, so there was another charge, he got rearrested, then called her again from jail, wanted her to pick him up, and was rearrested, and there was an issue with the service in the beginning, but once he had been arrested, she kept calling, and all he was doing was showing up, but she wasn't letting him in, and they had a child in common. The police arrested him, and we ended up going to trial on it, and they found that he was guilty of all the charges subsequent, because once he had been arrested on it, he couldn't say he didn't know about the protective order, right? So that's kind of goes back to like the call the police, and even though there's a piece of paper in effect, it helps deter, but obviously it's not, a lock and key. So.
More entertaining than the Jerry Springer show.
Sharon's right. Sharon, my former boss, got me down the domestic violence path and my passion for it.
It's a very dark thing.
Yes.
But that's how your brain tends to cope with it. People just do the stupidest things where at some point you just go, seriously? Really? I mean, really?
Yeah, definitely. So getting people, we also will have, victims will usually, they're gonna show up on their own. They'll show up at arraignment because they don't want this to go forward, and they don't want to prosecute, and they want to tell you that. And so that's our opportunity to have the court tell them, you have to come back for trial. So that's a lot of times how we get them to come into court, is from them showing up on their own, being uncooperative. So you can see how this gets a little bit messy, but it works in terms of like getting the case prosecuted and getting people on the right track. And then also this section has mandatory sentencing requirements, and so under the law, if you are sentenced on a DV conviction, so even like a vandalism, even like, say it's a charge where there's a battery between you and the husband and wife or whatever, and then the struggle with the cops, and that battery charge gets dismissed, and it's just they're pleading to that one count, or they're found guilty of that one count, because it's filed as DV, they still have to do all of these things, which is so great and so important under the law. And that's why I really stress about it being packaged, presented, and filed that way, because especially in a misdemeanor where a lot of times people are maybe just getting probation and some community service, or the sentence isn't as harsh because they tend to be like first-time offenders, right off the bat, regardless of whether you have a record or not, you're going to have at a minimum probation. You're going to have to do 52 domestic violence classes. You're going to have to pay a fine. You're going to have a protective order in place. You can't have any weapons typically, and so these things are all super cumbersome and important. And I think it kind of hits the message home a little bit harder than it would, on a case where you're like, well, I'm just on probation and just a community service, right? Because you've got a lot of stuff that you have to do, and you got to keep coming back to court and reporting on your progress and go to these classes. So, and it does, I don't want to say it works every time, because we know that's not true, but it works to the extent that it does help some people and turn some relationships around and end the cycle of violence, and that's really rewarding. Or it gets them separated and the victim gets clarity and moves on with their lives, which is also wonderful. So we kind of already talked about this, the filing stage. These are the kind of things that we're usually looking at: police reports, pictures, any videos, cell phone videos have been coming up a lot lately. There was a case with a very large male victim, female defendant, and if you read it on the face in the police report, and this kind of goes back to what Sharon was saying about the body cams being helpful as well, is that this woman kept attacking her husband, and she was jumping on his back, and the way the report read is that she was sort of bear hugging him, and you're kind of like, okay, is that a battery, but then he was very passive, and he, wasn't fighting back, wasn't being violent or anything, and he started just recording it on his phone, and you could see her really coming at him and him being like, please stop, please stop, please stop. And that evidence-wise, was really helpful, because when you have a big guy up there on the stand saying that my tiny little wife was bear hugging me, you're gonna have a hard time getting a jury to convict that little wife. And there's no other witnesses to this incident, but the video that he took really helped. And then I think she ended up pleading and takes responsibility and gets the help that she needed. And that's what he really wanted. He didn't even really want her to be prosecuted, but he wanted her to get help for her alcohol problem and her incur issues, and she did. So just some examples. And then we also like to know what's going on with the children, because a lot of times when we get the reports, these things happen sometimes months before, and so at this point when we're seeing it, we don't know, where they are, who has custody, what's going on with DCFS. So hopefully we can get information on that as well. Okay, this is just a little bit about crime classifications and examples. So misdemeanor only, which is what we deal with, certain charges like battery with no injury. Then I like to explain it to my family who's not lawyers or prosecutors as a misdemeanor is kind of, it's like something that you can go to jail for but not prison. So your sentence is typically in a number of days. Like I said, a typical misdemeanor is 180 days, but a typical domestic violence misdemeanor is 364 days. Yes, 4, not 5, because they changed the law like a year ago. So 1 day is shy of a year. Then they have wobblers, which are charges that can be filed as a misdemeanor or a felony. So that's when those prior instances really can be important, because a charge that we see a ton of, like a 273.5, was just basically just like a TV battery with injury. If there's a prior one, or if there's a misdemeanor conviction 243E, then the DA's office might be more likely to file it as a felony. And then there's the straight felony charges like murder and rape and those things. So when it comes to Long Beach, the way that it works, if you're curious, is who decides? District attorney or city prosecutor's office. So Long Beach is one of those cities that we have our own prosecution agency for misdemeanors. So if it falls on the misdemeanor list, then typically it would come straight to us. And if it, in terms of injuries or what's going on, if it falls on the felony list, it would go straight to the DA's office. If it's somewhere in between or they're unsure, it would go to the DA's office first, and then they would have to say, we're specifically not filing this as a felony, and we're referring it to the city prosecutor's office for misdemeanor filings. So actually, because of that, there's a lot of cases that we see that probably would be felonies in other jurisdictions, but because that option is available, it doesn't get filed as a felony. So not necessarily a good thing. All right, this would be kind of a typical misdemeanor injury: bruises, scratches, cuts, redness, and you're probably thinking, I don't see anything. And that's like what we're dealing with all the time is, very little, if any, injury. Black eye, bloody nose, no injuries at all. And then there's the bad injuries where you see this and you're like, is this a felony or a misdemeanor, right? What do you guys think? Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay, so you can see really bad black eye, right? The redness in the eye. So maybe there was some strangulation, some petechiae. There's a laceration, so we don't know if maybe there was a weapon used or not. Yeah.
This is the woman, this was the victim that I had. I thought this injury, and she was totally cooperative. She wanted to prosecute, to help. I sat in the DA's office for 2 hours one day trying to get them to file this as a felony, and they would not take it. So we had to prosecute it as a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, I hate to be this way, but because you have this split jurisdiction, every case that the DAs can foist off onto the city prosecutor's office is one less case that they have to handle. So, and they know that our office does a good job, so, it's...
Sharon said it all. Okay. So we see something like that, and of course, if that came straight to us, if the detectives didn't bring that to the DA's office first, we would refer it, because that's a pretty significant injury. But it really depends on the circumstances. So, was there a weapon involved? Was this woman pregnant? Were there children present? What's the history between the couple? What's the criminal history? Did she lose consciousness? Like you mentioned before, that's a kind of a big factor in terms of whether it gets filed as a felony or a misdemeanor. What kind of medical treatment was sought? Did somebody come to the scene? Did she end up going to the hospital? Did she get treatment? Okay, so do we try cases with uncooperative or recanting victims? Yes, definitely. Do we try them without victims? Yes, we do that too. But we're always kind of evaluating it when we're filing it, which I think sometimes maybe is hard for other agencies or other fields to understand, where you're like, something really happened here. Why didn't they go forward on it? And when we're looking at it, we're thinking, okay, are we going to be able to go forward without a victim or an uncooperative victim? What is the evidence? Because that's almost always where it ends up. So the main things, like I said, are the 911 call, because they're the freshest, photographs of the time, third-party witnesses, police officer observations, and their initial statements, because victims recant about 85% of the time. So when we see a victim, they are not ready to go to the shelter. They're usually in denial that there is any kind of like anger problems or violence that's going on. They like to say it's a misunderstanding or something like that. And they're also in denial that their children are in danger. Recanting, so that's when they would like change their story and either say that they lied to the police at the time of the incident. That's kind of the most typical, and here's what really happened, or the police are lying in the report. And then there's minimizing, which is another form of recanting, and probably maybe even more common than completely changing your story, because when you get in trouble and you don't want to admit the truth, what do? You rationalize, right? So you minimize like what happened. So maybe you'll say, I don't want him to get in trouble, so I can't deny that I have a black eye, but I'll say I fell down and my face hit a doorknob. And that's a real example of something a domestic violence victim would say. I had a case once where there was a witness. It happened in a parking garage, and this guy pushed this girl down, and she had a bruise right here from where he pushed her, and she fell, and there was a guy that saw it who was not related at all to the parties. And so I really think the case was successful because of him, because it was kind of like, who's telling the truth. But she literally got up there and told the jurors that she did not have a bruise, that was just dirt on her chest. So it's really sad, a lot of the things that we see, but hopefully going through this process and doing the classes and everything gets them to kind of wake up a little bit and get the help that they need. They usually want us to drop the charges, which I usually tell them that's not a thing. This isn't TV. That's not how it works. And a lot of times I'll try to explain to them, the victims, like it's out of your hands and the process, because I think a lot of times like they'll get a little bit more on board, at least to like show up or answer your calls or, you know, come to court when they're ordered to, if they think like, well, it's not me prosecuting, it's the court, it's the prosecutor. So that actually does help a little bit if you kind of shift the burden onto you in terms of helping the victims get through this process. Or they're overly cooperative, which doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, that's pretty nuts too. So that's usually when there's some sort of like agenda or, you know, custody battle going on behind the scenes, things like that. So that's something that we always like kind of have to flesh out too, read between the lines. So successful prosecution, like I said, is based on evidence, regardless of kind of what we believe happened. We've got to look at the totality of the evidence. These are the cases that allow us to go forward without victims or when they're recanting. Okay, this is kind of extensive, and I know we're running out of time. So I was going to explain to you guys kind of the process of how we get to impeaching a witness. And I have a whole flow chart. But I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You have a copy of it on there, but the gist of it is that basically when you put a victim on the stand, there's 3 ways they can go. They can admit to everything and be cooperative and tell the truth and not exaggerate or minimize, which typically doesn't happen. That's more for like a normal case. They either say, I don't know, or I don't recall. And so if they are cooperative, great. That's kind of what a normal criminal case with like a police officer witness would look like. And that goes a lot smoother than a domestic violence case with a civilian witness. The whole end goal of the impeachment process is to get to the point where you've done it correctly so that you can call your officer or maybe a civilian witness to come up and say, she told me this, she told me that. Because as prosecutors, we can't do that until we've given the victim an opportunity to explain or deny what happened. And I don't want to get too legalese on you guys. When they start to say, I don't recall, that can get even a little bit more complicated than a straight out denial. So at the end of the day, we want to get down to this green box that says, call, impeach witness, use prior inconsistent statement, and we want to give them an opportunity to explain or deny. So, sorry I went through that kind of fast and didn't really like explain it as thoroughly as I wanted to, but you can come talk to me about it later if you want to. Okay. So we believe it happened, like I said, and sometimes, you know, regardless of that, the things that we have to look at is, can we prove it? Can we prove it without a victim? And can we prove it with a victim that's minimizing or recanting? The first time they're in court, the defendant, when the case is filed, they're advised of the charges. Ourselves or our victim advocate will talk to the victims. We'll get an initial statement. That's when they usually say, I want to drop the case. And then at that point, you know, some people will say, I want to take responsibility and I want to plea now, and some people want to fight it, and so typically bail will get set on a DV case. And when they don't settle, we then have the witnesses ordered back, and we issue the protective order. Okay, when they come back for their pretrial, it's usually in a couple weeks, and this is when things start to get a little bit hairy with the victims. This is kind of when a little bit of time has passed, and when they are usually more vocal, I think, about either not coming in or not wanting to prosecute. And this is just an example, a letter of a victim that we had recently, I think in the last year or so. that she wrote to us saying that she didn't want to prosecute, she didn't want to go forward, that it's all her fault. I think there's a copy of this in your packet, and this is what she looked like. So you can imagine the situation. Am I out of time? Okay. Sorry.
If you would stay for a few minutes if you have any additional questions, but I just wanted to thank Stephanie for a wonderful presentation with and without technology problems. Thank you so much.